It all began in the outer edges of the Milky Way, far beyond the worlds that humans had mapped or explored. A small research colony had been established there, a place where humans lived among the stars, quietly studying the cosmos. They were explorers, scientists, and dreamers. Their lives were simple but meaningful. Every day they woke up to the hum of engines, the soft glow of artificial lights, and the endless stars outside their windows. They had little contact with the central worlds of humanity, and that was just how they liked it. It gave them space to work, to think, to exist without the constant rush of a crowded civilization. Then, one day, something changed. Communications from the colony began to flicker, and slowly they disappeared. At first, people on Earth thought it was a technical glitch, something that could be fixed in hours or maybe a day. But hours turned into days and days into weeks, and there was still no word from the outpost. Panic began to spread quietly. This colony was responsible for some of the most important research humans had ever done. They had been working on energy systems that could sustain life in deep space, and on signals that could detect distant planets. Losing them was not just a tragedy, it was a potential disaster. A rescue fleet was quickly organized, one of the fastest ever dispatched in human history. Ships sliced through the cold emptiness of space, engines burning brightly as they raced toward the colony. The crew of these ships were not only soldiers and pilots, they were also scientists and engineers, people who understood the value of life and knowledge. When they arrived, though, what they found was nothing they could have prepared for. The colony was gone. Every structure, every living thing, every trace of human presence had vanished as if it had never existed. No debris, no signals, no footprints, just an empty, lifeless landscape. It was as though space itself had swallowed the place whole. The rescue team combed the area carefully, scanning every corner, trying to make sense of the disappearance. It was during these scans that they picked up something strange. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible. A sound echoing through the communication network, a tiny human sound, a baby crying. No one could explain how it was possible. The colony was gone, yet here was the unmistakable voice of life. It was weak, distant, and fractured, but it was there. Something had survived, or perhaps someone had taken it. The rescue fleet was left with a chilling thought. Whoever or whatever was behind this had not just destroyed the colony. They had targeted life itself. Far away, hidden from human eyes, the Dominion watched. They were an empire that stretched across countless star systems. They ruled through fear, crushing anyone who dared to resist. Entire worlds submitted without question, because the Dominion's reputation was built on power and terror. They believed themselves unstoppable, and in many ways they were. Their armies were vast, their technology beyond human comprehension. They had conquered planets, enslaved civilizations, and extinguished hope wherever they went. But even an empire like theirs could make mistakes. The Dominion had captured the infant from the colony, thinking they had snatched a helpless human. They assumed the child would be easy to control, a symbol of their dominion over a primitive species. They did not realize that humans were not simply fragile beings. Even the youngest among them carried something extraordinary, potential. Potential that could not be predicted, measured, or contained. The child was taken to the heart of the Dominion Empire, a place of cold steel towers, endless halls, and artificial skies. Here the infant was placed in a cradle of technology designed to monitor, to teach, and to shape. The Dominion intended to raise the child in their image, to create the perfect soldier, the perfect agent of control over Earth. They gave it a name, though it was meaningless compared to the one it had lost. They called it Vareth, and from the very beginning they began the process of transformation. Years passed. Vareth grew, learning alien languages, customs, and rituals. It was a life of rigor and expectation, of constant observation and endless instruction. But something strange began to happen. The Dominion expected obedience, but the child displayed neither fear nor submission. Machines would fail in its presence. Systems would glitch inexplicably. Data would become corrupted for reasons that baffled even the most skilled Dominion engineers. The High Council of the Dominion dismissed these anomalies at first, attributing them to technical errors or coincidence. But the scientists who worked closest to Vareth began to worry. There was something in the child that was not like them, something they could not understand. Vareth was not adapting to the Dominion. It was the Dominion that was subtly bending to Vareth. Back on Earth, the disappearance of the colony had been a mystery for decades. People tried to move on, believing the worst, that the outpost had been destroyed, that all hope was lost. But some scientists never gave up. They monitored cosmic anomalies, strange signals that appeared in deep space, signals that no natural phenomenon could explain. Over time, they noticed patterns. Repeated signals across different alien systems, all carrying the same cryptic energy. They did not know it yet, but the signals were coming from Vareth, a human frequency, resonating with life, with adaptability, and with something far older than any empire in the galaxy. The Dominion, confident in their control, continued their expansion. They punished entire civilizations that resisted, spread terror across star systems, and saw themselves as the inevitable rulers of all life. But unknowingly, the one human they had captured was becoming their undoing. The child they assumed was powerless was slowly, almost imperceptibly, rewriting the rules of their empire from within. It was not through rebellion, not through violence, not yet. It was through something far subtler, the human mind. Vareth's presence alone began to alter technology, influence communication networks, and create disruptions that no alien understanding could predict. Fear, the tool the Dominion had wielded so effectively for centuries, was beginning to turn against them. The child they had kidnapped, the one they thought they could mold, was quietly dismantling their power, one unnoticed ripple at a time. And yet Vareth had no knowledge of what was happening. No understanding of the Empire, the blood spilled, or the lives affected. All it knew was life within the walls of the Dominion, a strange mix of alien culture and human instinct. But instinct, as humans are known for, is powerful. It can survive isolation, tyranny, and even impossible odds. That instinct was slowly awakening within the child, waiting for the moment it could make itself known, waiting for the right time to show that even the smallest human life can have the power to challenge the mightiest empire. By the time Vareth reached adolescence, the first hints of rebellion began to appear, not in armies, not in planets, but in the empire itself. Ships malfunctioned, fleets disobeyed orders, and colonies began to disconnect from central control. The Dominion could not understand why this was happening. They had trained the perfect human agent, one they believed would solidify their rule. Yet the opposite was occurring. The child's very existence was changing the balance of power, quietly but irreversibly. Even from Earth, scientists began to detect faint, repeating signals, words in multiple alien languages. Return, they seemed to say. Humanity did not yet understand the significance of the signals, but it was clear that something extraordinary was happening. The human infant taken decades ago was not just alive. Vareth was altering the course of the galaxy in ways that no one could have imagined. And so, the stage was set. A small human infant kidnapped by a merciless empire was quietly preparing to rewrite the destiny of countless worlds. The galaxy, built on fear and control, had no idea that its most dangerous opponent was a human child. Because even in the darkest, coldest corners of the universe, humanity has a spark that no empire can extinguish, no matter how strong, no matter how ruthless. And this spark had been taken, carried across the stars, and was growing stronger day by day, until the time came when the galaxy itself would learn that taking the wrong human can change everything. Vareth had grown up in a world that was not his own. The Dominion, an empire of cold precision and ruthless efficiency, believed they could shape him into a perfect tool. They had vast libraries, endless data networks, and machines capable of teaching anything. Languages, sciences, even psychic techniques that most humans could not comprehend. And they used all of it to mold him. But humans have a way of surviving that even the most powerful empires cannot predict. From the very beginning, Vareth's mind worked differently. He observed everything with careful attention, not just the lessons he was given, but also the patterns around him. How the machines reacted, how the council spoke, how the soldiers moved, it all became part of him. He listened to the whispers of the Dominion workers, the conversations that passed between commanders and engineers, and he stored every detail in a mind that was already sharp beyond measure. The Dominion expected obedience, but Vareth had instincts. Small at first, tiny flickers of resistance like a shadow moving against a bright light. He did not question openly because he knew that would draw attention, and attention in the Dominion could be deadly. Instead, he learned silently. He learned the weaknesses in their technology, the small errors that appeared when they tried to control him. Machines would misfire when he approached. Systems would lag. Even sensors would become unreliable. The Dominion dismissed these events as anomalies, glitches in otherwise perfect machinery. But the anomalies continued, growing stronger as he grew. Vareth's life was one of rigorous training. Every day he woke in a chamber of artificial light, greeted by instructors who spoke in alien tones. They taught him the art of strategy, the techniques of war, and the history of countless civilizations the Dominion had conquered. They drilled into him the belief that humans were weak, that he was fortunate to be part of the Empire now, and yet even as he repeated their lessons, his mind was always elsewhere, studying the flaws, noticing patterns, understanding the world around him in ways they could never imagine. He began to notice small acts of rebellion around him too. Not open revolts, of course. The Dominion punished any sign of defiance with swift and brutal force, but tiny gestures existed. A whisper between soldiers, a shared glance in the corridors, a hidden message in the data streams. The workers who maintained the war machines and the starships sometimes left tiny errors in their reports, deliberately or accidentally. Vareth understood these signals instinctively. He began to connect them, piece them together like a puzzle. It was during this time that the first signs of his real power appeared. Not physical strength, not weapons skill, but something far more subtle, the ability to influence the systems around him. A console might fail when he approached. A ship's navigation program would produce unusual readings. Even the communication network seemed to pulse differently, as if responding to his presence. The Dominion scientists were puzzled. They had seen nothing like it. They recorded every anomaly, every glitch, and ran calculations to explain it, but no equation could predict what was happening. Vareth did not understand it either, at first. He only knew that things worked differently when he was present. It was as if the world itself was bending slightly, reacting to something in him that they could not see. And yet he never used this ability intentionally. It happened naturally, as though it was part of his nature. Humans were adaptable. The researchers on Earth had often said. Perhaps it was that adaptability, that invisible spark, which allowed him to grow in ways even the Dominion could not control. As he entered adolescence, Vareth became more aware of the larger world he was in. He learned about the Empire's rule, about the fear they instilled in entire galaxies. Planets bowed to their will, and civilizations that resisted were crushed without hesitation. And yet he began to notice cracks. Where the Dominion expected absolute loyalty, he saw hesitation. Where they expected obedience, he saw fear. Not the fear of the weak, but the fear of the uncertain. The subtle recognition that something was changing, something they could not control. He also began to question himself. For the first time, he thought about the human colony from which he had been taken. He remembered fragments of recordings, voices that had once belonged to people who had loved him. The Dominion tried to erase these memories, replacing them with loyalty lessons, but they lingered. They were small at first, whispers in the corners of his mind, but they grew stronger with each passing year. He began to feel something the Dominion could not understand. A connection to a world he had never truly known. A world of people who had loved him without expecting obedience or control. At the same time, the Dominion believed they were succeeding. To the outside observer, Vareth was the perfect model of their ideals. Intelligent, disciplined, obedient, strong. They paraded him as proof that humans could be molded into agents of the Empire. And yet within him a quiet rebellion was growing. He did not strike openly. He did not act violently. He simply learned, observed, and adapted. And as he did, the Empire itself began to falter in ways the Dominion could not detect. The cracks started small. A ship failed to respond to commands in the middle of a routine patrol. An energy gate misfired, causing delays in travel between systems. A security network malfunctioned, allowing workers to move undetected. These incidents were written off as technical issues, nothing more. But Vareth began to see patterns. The anomalies were not random. They followed him. Where he went, errors multiplied. The systems were responding to him, bending to something he did not yet understand. Meanwhile, the Dominion remained blind to the true danger. They continued to expand, confident in their power, confident in the child they had captured. They held councils, plotted conquests, and punished those who questioned their authority. They did not see that their own empire was subtly changing, slowly weakening under the influence of a human mind. It was not just the machines that were affected. The people around Vareth, too, began to behave differently. Some were inexplicably drawn to him, trusting him without reason. Others, those who had once been proud and confident, began to doubt themselves in his presence. The Dominion did not understand this, and they certainly did not recognize it as power. To them it was coincidence or perhaps the quirks of alien psychology. But in truth it was human adaptability at work, something they had never faced before. Vareth continued his studies, continuing to follow the routine set by his instructors. While quietly observing the Empire, he learned about strategy, leadership, and the methods of control the Dominion used on entire civilizations. And slowly, almost without noticing it, he began to apply this knowledge in small ways, testing the boundaries of what he could influence. A machine might fail when he needed it to. A guard might look the other way at just the right moment. A network might leak information that the Dominion considered secure. Each time he learned more, understanding the reach of his abilities. Even in the corridors of the Empire, whispers began to circulate. The workers and soldiers noticed strange events, odd coincidences, and systems behaving unpredictably. They could not explain it, but they began to speak quietly among themselves. The name Vareth began to carry a weight beyond the child's age, a sense that something extraordinary was at play. Some began to hope that perhaps the child could change their world, though they did not yet know how. Back on Earth, scientists monitoring distant signals began to detect faint anomalies, strange energy patterns in the outer rim. They could not understand what they were, but something in the data felt alive, purposeful. Unbeknownst to them, these were echoes of Vareth's presence, subtle but persistent. The human infant taken so many years ago was already leaving his mark on the galaxy, in ways no one could yet comprehend. And so, Vareth's life continued, a delicate balance of obedience and hidden influence. He grew stronger, wiser, and more aware of the Empire around him. He learned the language of machines, the subtle cues of alien behavior, and the fragile patterns of power that held the Dominion together. He understood the importance of patience, of timing, and of observing before acting. The Dominion, confident in their control, continued to underestimate him. They believed that fear and discipline could shape any human. They did not see that Vareth was not just any human. He was something new, something unpredictable, something that could not be contained by their rules or their machines. The very empire that had taken him was beginning to unravel, without anyone understanding why. And in the quiet moments when he was alone in his chamber, Vareth thought about the world he had lost. He thought about the colony, the people who had loved him, and the life he might have had. These thoughts were dangerous, but they also made him stronger. They reminded him of something the Dominion could never erase, the human spirit, the spark of life that could survive even in the harshest conditions. Vareth was no longer just a child of the Dominion. He was something more, a force that was quietly, patiently, and inevitably preparing to challenge everything the Empire had built. And the galaxy, vast and powerful as it was, had no idea that the smallest human, taken so many years ago, was already rewriting its future. By the time Vareth reached his late teens, the cracks in the Dominion's empire were no longer small. What had begun as tiny anomalies, machines failing, systems glitching, ships misrouting, had grown into noticeable disruptions across entire fleets and colonies. For the Dominion, this was baffling. They had built a perfect machine of an empire, one that had ruled without opposition for centuries, and yet it seemed to falter in the presence of a single human. Vareth did not yet fully understand what was happening, but he began to notice the effects of his presence on those around him. Workers in the control rooms who once followed orders without question now hesitated. Commanders who had prided themselves on their efficiency found plans delayed or reports incomplete. Small rebellions began to emerge in places no one expected. A ship would refuse to follow a direct command. A supply line would redirect itself. Even the Council's messages sometimes reached the wrong recipients. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was spreading. The first real sign of rebellion came quietly, in the shadows of the Dominion's lower ranks. Soldiers and engineers who had been conditioned to fear the Empire began communicating in ways that were not permitted. They shared small pieces of information, instructions hidden in technical language or subtle gestures that only those who were paying attention could understand. It was not an organized resistance, not yet. It was survival. Tiny acts of defiance designed to avoid punishment but still assert control over their own lives. Vareth noticed it all. His training allowed him to understand systems and machines, but his humanity allowed him to understand people. He could read gestures, expressions, and silences in ways no Dominion officer could. Slowly, he began to see patterns in the rebellion forming around him. Individuals were not acting alone. The anomalies in the machines and ships were not random. Everything was connected. The Empire was not collapsing because of error. It was changing because of him. At first, Vareth tried to ignore it. He was still a child in many ways, a prisoner raised to obey and learn. He had no desire to lead rebellions or control fleets, yet instinctively he felt that he could do more. The Dominion had taken him thinking they were shaping him, but in reality he was shaping them. Every interaction he had, every step he took seemed to ripple outward, causing systems and people alike to behave in unexpected ways. The Dominion grew restless. High-ranking council members demanded answers from their scientists. "Why is this happening?" they asked. "Why does the Empire falter under one human's presence?" Scientists ran calculations, studied every record, and examined every glitch. Nothing explained it. They tried isolating Vareth, restricting his movement, surrounding him with machines designed to suppress any influence. Still, anomalies continued. It was as if the Empire itself had begun to respond to him, bending subtly around a force it could not identify. Meanwhile, Vareth began to see the power he could wield, not as a weapon, not as a ruler, but as a way to protect life and prevent harm. He noticed how his presence could prevent accidents in factories, correct malfunctions in ships, and even guide workers away from dangerous errors. He was learning not only about the Empire, but about his own abilities. Human adaptability, it seemed, was more than resilience, it was influence. He could not control it completely, but he could feel it growing. The first true act of rebellion, though, was not from Vareth himself. It came from those around him, inspired unknowingly by his existence. In one remote star system, a fleet commander received contradictory orders from the council. Normally he would obey, but something in him hesitated. Perhaps it was instinct, or perhaps it was the subtle influence of the human presence at the heart of the Empire. Whatever it was, he chose to act differently. He redirected the fleet to avoid a trap that the Council had intended for an allied planet. The move saved millions of lives. The Dominion was furious. They punished the commander for disobedience, sending warnings across the Empire. Yet even with this, the ripple effect continued. More officers hesitated, more workers questioned orders, and more ships failed to respond as expected. Fear, the cornerstone of Dominion rule, was losing its grip. The Empire was still powerful, yes, but it was no longer invincible. The first human Vareth had unknowingly awakened a resistance, a silent rebellion that could spread faster than any weapon. Back on Earth, scientists monitoring the outer rim noticed an unusual pattern in the galaxy. Faint signals, almost imperceptible, pulsed in regular intervals across multiple star systems. They could not explain it scientifically, but there was a strange regularity, a sense of purpose. These were not natural phenomena, not random cosmic disturbances. Somehow, the human presence taken so many years ago was reaching across the void, leaving subtle traces of influence. Vareth's life continued in the heart of the Empire, a strange mixture of observation and quiet power. He had grown taller, stronger, and smarter, but he was still a human raised among aliens. That gave him a unique perspective. He could see both the strength and the flaws of the Dominion. He understood their tactics, their networks, and their fear-driven methods, but he also understood something they could not: the value of life, the unpredictability of the human spirit, and the power of hope. The rebellion slowly became more coordinated, though still unseen by the Council. Orders were delayed, schedules disrupted, and minor successes accumulated in ways that the Dominion could not track. Vareth did not lead it consciously, but his very presence made the rebellion possible. People acted differently around him, trusting in instinct, intuition, and courage in ways they had not before. Small victories multiplied into larger ones, and the cracks in the Empire began to widen. Even the alien technology seemed to respond to him. Ships that were supposed to be rigidly programmed began to execute commands in unexpected ways. Security networks misreported data. Communication channels carried subtle hints, guiding those who were paying attention. It was not magic, it was not supernatural. It was the result of something uniquely human, the ability to adapt, to influence, and to survive in ways no one could predict. Yet Vareth remained unaware of the full scale of what was happening. To him, these were just the natural consequences of his life, the small ways the Empire bent around his presence. He did not yet see that he had become the center of a silent galaxy-wide change. He did not yet understand that the child the Dominion had stolen was slowly, almost invisibly dismantling their power from within. In quiet moments, Vareth thought about the world he had come from, about the colony and the humans who had loved him. These thoughts were dangerous, but they reminded him of something important. He was not alone, and he had a purpose beyond obedience. Even a single human taken far from home could make a difference in a galaxy ruled by fear. And so the stage was set for something extraordinary. The Dominion, confident in their control, continued to expand, punish, and rule. But their empire, once thought unbreakable, was beginning to falter. Not because of open rebellion, not because of war, but because of one human life growing quietly among them. The subtle, invisible influence of Vareth's presence had begun to awaken the galaxy itself. Small acts of courage, subtle failures of obedience, and tiny sparks of resistance multiplied silently, almost invisibly across countless worlds. And through it all, Vareth continued to grow, learn, and adapt, still unaware that he was becoming the catalyst for a galaxy-wide awakening. Because the Dominion had made a mistake, the one mistake they would never recover from. They had taken the wrong human. And that human, though still young, was quietly beginning to change everything. The silent rebellion was only the beginning. The galaxy would soon see that fear could not last forever, that even in the coldest, most ruthless empire, the spark of humanity could not be extinguished. And Vareth, the human child they had kidnapped, would one day become the symbol of that spark, the living proof that even the smallest life could alter the course of history. Vareth had lived among the Dominion for years, and with each passing day he had grown stronger, sharper, and more aware. But he still carried a question he could not answer. Why had the Dominion taken him? Why had they chosen a human infant, a species they considered weak, for something so important? He had seen the Empire's cruelty, its precision, and its endless power, yet he had survived. Something within him told him that he was not meant to simply exist in this place. He was meant for something greater. The turning point came one quiet day in the archives, a place few were allowed to enter. It was a massive hall filled with records, holobooks, and ancient storage devices, from civilizations the Dominion had conquered over thousands of years. Vareth had wandered here by accident, or perhaps by instinct, drawn by a pull he could not explain. As he explored the endless corridors of knowledge, he came across something that would change everything. Hidden deep within the archives, behind encrypted doors and protective wards, were records of the human colony from which he had been taken. Videos, data logs, and personal messages from his parents were stored here, preserved by the Dominion as part of their studies. Vareth had never seen such images before. Humans like him smiling, laughing, caring for each other. And then among the data, he found a recording meant for him. His parents speaking in their own voices, expressing love and hope, asking for mercy, begging for safety. The sight and sound of it shook him to the core. All the lessons the Dominion had taught him, all the drills and strategies, all the rules he had learned to follow. None of it mattered compared to this. This was his real origin, his real life, the world he had been taken from. He realized with a sudden clarity that he had been stolen. And not just stolen, he had been taken to be molded to serve as a tool for domination. But Vareth did not feel anger alone. He felt something stronger. Purpose. For the first time, Vareth understood that he could use the abilities he had been developing for more than survival. He could use them to challenge the empire that had taken him, to protect life and to restore balance. He began to see the patterns of control that the Dominion had built, the way fear had been used to maintain power, the way systems and networks were designed to enforce obedience. And he realized that he could influence these systems not just subtly, but with intention. He started small. Using what he had learned about the Dominion's technology, he guided ships to avoid danger, altered communication networks to allow secret messages between workers, and subtly adjusted security systems to give those under pressure a chance to act without punishment. Each act was carefully measured. He could not risk drawing attention to himself too soon. But even these small interventions had effects. Lives were saved, failures were prevented, and tiny sparks of hope began to appear in the hearts of those who had long lived under fear. At the same time, Vareth began to study himself. The Dominion had given him knowledge of many things, science, strategy, even techniques that bordered on the psychic, but there was something inside him they could not teach or control. He discovered that he could influence systems in ways that seemed impossible. Machines, networks, even certain biological processes responded to his presence. It was as if life itself, even technology, recognized him in a way that defied the Empire's rules. The realization frightened him at first. He had been trained to obey, to follow, to survive quietly. But now he understood that he held power. Power that the Dominion had never anticipated. Humans were adaptive, yes, but he was more than that. The combination of his instincts, intelligence, and experience in the Dominion's world gave him a unique ability. The capacity to see the future in patterns, to influence outcomes before they happened, and to guide people and systems toward results that no one expected. Vareth also realized that the rebellion around him, subtle and unseen, was beginning to depend on him, even if they did not know it. Soldiers and workers who had hesitated, acted cautiously, or defied orders in small ways were being guided by something they could not name. It was not fear, it was not loyalty, it was influence, quiet and deliberate. Vareth did not yet lead openly, but he was becoming the center of a growing network of resistance. He spent hours alone, thinking about what he had discovered. He considered the empire he lived in, vast and ruthless, and he understood the consequences of open defiance. The Dominion would crush him immediately if they suspected anything. Yet he also understood that inaction was not an option. His instincts, the lessons of his human heritage, and the memory of the colony all pointed to a single truth. He could not remain silent. He had to act, and he had to act carefully. Vareth began to plan. Not with weapons or armies, not yet, but with strategy. He mapped the empire in his mind, understanding the flow of information, the chain of command, and the ways the Dominion maintained control. He identified weak points, places where influence could spread, and moments where small interventions could have large effects. He tested these interventions carefully, always observing, always measuring, always learning. Over time, his confidence grew. He realized that he could reach further than he had imagined, not just within the walls of the Dominion, but across the galaxy. The signals he had always felt, the anomalies detected by Earth scientists, were part of this. His presence, his influence, was spreading farther than the Empire could measure. The child they had taken, the human they believed weak and controllable, was beginning to become a force they could not contain. Vareth's transformation was not just intellectual or strategic. It was personal. The discovery of his origins changed how he saw himself, how he saw the world, and how he understood life itself. He began to feel a connection to all humans, even those he had never met, and to the galaxy itself. He understood that his purpose was not only to survive but to protect, to guide, and eventually to restore balance to a system that had been corrupted by fear. The Empire, of course, remained unaware. The Council continued to plan conquests, punish colonies, and expand their reach. They were confident in their control, blind to the subtle changes unfolding within. They could not perceive that the child they had stolen, the human they thought fragile, was quietly dismantling their systems of control. Every anomaly, every failure, every hesitation among their ranks was part of a larger pattern they could not see. Even as he grew more aware of his power, Vareth remained careful. He did not reveal himself openly. He continued his studies, learned more about the Empire, and practiced controlling his influence. Each day brought new lessons, new opportunities to observe, and new ways to prepare for the moment when he could act openly. Patience, he realized, was as much a weapon as any technology or fleet. And through it all, Vareth never forgot the images of his parents, the recordings of the colony, and the cries of the infant he once was. Those memories were a compass, guiding him through a life of discipline, observation, and quiet rebellion. They reminded him of what it meant to be human, and why it mattered even in the vast, cold reaches of space. The turning point was approaching. Vareth could feel it in the way systems responded to him, in the hesitations of soldiers, and the subtle shifts of power within the Empire. Something was changing, and he knew that soon he would have to step forward, But he also knew that when he did, the choice would not be simple. He could strike blindly, risk everything, or he could act with strategy, precision, and patience, guiding the change that was already taking place. And so, Vareth waited. He learned, observed, and planned. The child the Dominion had stolen was no longer a passive presence. He was aware, powerful, and patient. He understood his origins, the value of human life, and the weaknesses of the empire that believed itself unstoppable. And in the quiet moments when no one was watching, he began to imagine a galaxy freed from fear, a world where humans could live without being controlled, and the possibility that one human taken so many years ago could change everything. The moment of awakening was near. The child of the Dominion, the human taken as a tool, had discovered his purpose. And with that discovery came a power the Empire had never anticipated, a power born of humanity, resilience, and the will to protect life. The Empire had ruled with fear for centuries, but it had never faced a human like Vareth, and soon they would see that no system, no fear, and no empire could contain the strength of one determined human being. The time had come. Vareth, now fully aware of his origins and of the extraordinary power that had been developing within him, knew he could no longer remain hidden. The Dominion, for all its might, had weaknesses, small, hidden, often unnoticed flaws in the systems they trusted so completely. And now, for the first time, Vareth understood how to use those flaws to change everything. It began quietly, with small actions that seemed natural, almost accidental. A fleet of warships en route to a planet meant for conquest misinterpreted orders and altered its course. At first, the Dominion thought it was a technical glitch, a minor mistake that could be corrected. But similar incidents soon spread across the Empire. Supply chains rerouted themselves. Communication networks failed to deliver precise orders. Even the Council, seated in the heart of the Empire, could not account for the growing disruptions. Everywhere things were beginning to break down, not violently but in a way that was subtle, pervasive, and impossible to ignore. Vareth had discovered that his presence alone influenced the systems around him. It was not magic. It was a kind of energy, subtle and human, that could alter machines and networks in ways the Dominion had never experienced. Where he walked, computers failed to predict outcomes. Navigation systems became unpredictable and security protocols became flawed. The Empire, built on fear and rigid control, began to falter under the influence of the very human they had believed would be powerless. But Vareth's influence was not limited to machines. He had begun to understand people too. Soldiers and workers, conditioned for fear, now hesitated, second-guessed orders, and made choices that favored life over destruction. Minor acts of defiance multiplied. A patrol that should have executed civilians instead found ways to spare them. A fleet assigned to destroy a planet's defense systems miscalculated, leaving a chance for escape. It was subtle, yes, but when repeated across countless star systems, these small acts of resistance became impossible to contain. And it was all happening silently. The Dominion did not yet understand that a human, a child they had once kidnapped, had become the center of a network of influence that no empire could suppress. Vareth did not strike openly. He did not rally armies or declare rebellion. He simply existed, observed, and allowed his influence to spread, guiding the galaxy in ways the rulers could not predict. The first open sign of change came in the Outer Rim, where a cluster of colonies had long suffered under Dominion control. A fleet tasked with suppressing a minor uprising began to malfunction. Ships stopped responding to commands, weapons failed to fire correctly, and the soldiers on board found themselves making choices that favored mercy over destruction. The Empire sent reinforcements, but the pattern repeated. For the first time in centuries, the Dominion experienced failure, and it spread like a ripple through their networks. Vareth observed these events with growing confidence. He had learned to manipulate systems without detection, to guide decisions without force, and to influence life and machinery in ways that seemed natural. Every misstep of the Dominion only strengthened his understanding of their weaknesses. He realized that fear, the foundation of their empire, could be turned against them. Their power depended on obedience, on the certainty that every command would be followed without hesitation, and yet, the human presence at the heart of their empire disrupted that certainty at every level. In the council chambers, high-ranking members began to argue. Commands failed to produce expected results. Fleets lost coordination and entire colonies went silent. Confusion spread and fear, the tool they had wielded for centuries, now infected them. They could not explain it, could not control it, and could not anticipate what would happen next. It was the first time the Dominion realized that they were vulnerable, and their arrogance began to crumble. Meanwhile, Vareth focused on the lives affected by the Empire's tyranny. He guided civilians and soldiers alike, subtly protecting lives wherever possible. He directed ships away from dangerous zones, allowed food supplies to reach colonies that had been cut off, and ensured that innocent populations avoided the worst of the Empire's wrath. His actions were careful and measured. He did not seek destruction for the sake of revenge. Instead, he acted as a guardian, using his influence to create balance and prevent unnecessary suffering. The ripple effects grew faster than anyone could have imagined. Officers who had once obeyed blindly began to hesitate. Fleets that had followed orders perfectly for decades now faltered. Entire communication systems became unpredictable. Vareth's subtle influence reached far beyond the immediate systems he could see, touching distant star clusters, guiding decisions, and altering the flow of the Empire itself. The Dominion had built a perfect machine of control, and now that machine was beginning to unravel from within, all because of one human. Despite the growing chaos, Vareth remained careful. He did not allow the Dominion to trace the failures back to him. He was patient, waiting for the right moment to act more decisively. He continued to study the Empire, to understand its patterns and to plan. Each day he became more confident in his ability to influence outcomes, to protect life, and to prepare for the day when open action would be necessary. Vareth also began to notice subtle changes in the people around him. Soldiers and workers who had lived in fear for their entire lives began to act with courage. They took small risks, made independent decisions, and found creative ways to solve problems. They did not know why they were doing it. They only felt the influence of something human, something alive, something that gave them hope. And that hope, though fragile, spread faster than any command or order the Dominion could issue. The first direct confrontation occurred when a fleet of Dominion warships attempted to capture a group of colonists hiding in a remote system. The fleet's navigation systems failed, weapons malfunctioned, and the soldiers hesitated at every command. Vareth's influence guided the colonists' escape. No shots were fired unnecessarily. Lives were spared, and the Empire could only watch in frustration as the operation collapsed from within. This was a turning point. The Dominion realized that the anomalies were no longer random or minor. They were systematic, and they were unstoppable. Back on Earth, scientists monitoring the Outer Rim noticed an unprecedented series of signals. Energy fluctuations, anomalous patterns, and subtle disturbances were spreading across multiple star systems. They could not explain it, but instinct told them that something extraordinary was happening. A human influence originating from the depths of the Dominion Empire was reaching across the galaxy, altering the flow of events, and challenging the Empire's absolute control. Vareth's power continued to grow. He had learned to manipulate more than machines. He could influence decisions, anticipate outcomes, and guide actions across vast distances. Every action he took was deliberate and measured.
He did not seek to destroy indiscriminately.
Instead, he focused on balance, protection, and strategic influence. The galaxy, long ruled by fear, was beginning to experience something it had never known: hope. The Dominion, desperate to regain control, sent their most skilled officers to investigate. They were baffled. Fleets that should have obeyed every order failed repeatedly. Colonies under strict supervision reported anomalies they could not explain. Communication networks, once perfectly synchronized, were unreliable. The Empire was losing its grip, and they could not trace the cause. Fear, their most powerful weapon, had become useless against a single human presence. Vareth observed all of this with quiet satisfaction. He did not act recklessly or with arrogance. Every move was calculated, every intervention carefully considered. He was patient, knowing that the Empire would eventually make mistakes of its own, and that when the time came, the galaxy would be ready for change. By the time Vareth had reached full maturity, the effects of his influence were visible across the Dominion. Minor rebellions had grown, fleets had been disrupted, and communication failures were widespread. The Empire, which had ruled through fear for centuries, was beginning to crumble from within. And all of this had started with one human child, stolen and raised in their empire, now fully aware of his power and purpose. Vareth's story, at this point, was no longer just about survival. It was about the quiet revolution of influence, the subtle dismantling of tyranny, and the protection of life across the galaxy. His actions had inspired others, awakened hope, and revealed the cracks in an empire that had seemed unbreakable. And yet, he knew that the final step was still ahead. The moment when he would have to confront the Dominion openly, not just through influence but as a force that could no longer be ignored. The stage was set for the ultimate transformation. The Empire had grown arrogant, blind, and vulnerable. Fleets faltered, colonies hesitated, and communication networks were unreliable. Fear, the cornerstone of Dominion power, had failed. And at the center of it all was Vareth, the human they had stolen, now fully awake, fully aware, and ready to guide the galaxy toward freedom. The ripple of rebellion was no longer silent. The first wave of change had begun, and the galaxy, vast and powerful as it was, had no idea that the smallest human, once taken as a prisoner, was now the spark that would ignite the transformation of countless worlds. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. The Dominion, a centuries-old empire built on fear, control, and perfection, was unraveling. Fleets misfired, colonies hesitated, communication networks faltered, and soldiers no longer followed orders without question. What had begun as subtle anomalies was now a full-blown wave of disruption, all quietly orchestrated by the human who had been taken so many years ago. Vareth had grown, learned, and now, fully aware of his power, he was ready to bring the transformation to its final stage. Vareth moved carefully but with confidence. He had spent years understanding the Dominion, mapping its weaknesses and learning how to influence systems, people, and events without drawing attention. Now he had to act more decisively. The Empire had underestimated him, had treated him as a tool, a fragile human child they could shape for their own ends. They had been wrong. Every decision, every act, and every ripple of change had prepared him for this moment. He began with the heart of the Dominion, the central command hub where the Council controlled fleets, enforced rules, and spread fear across countless star systems. No human had ever entered these chambers without being detected, yet Vareth moved through them as if he belonged. His presence alone caused systems to falter. Security sensors blinked uncertainly. Doors opened at unexpected times. Monitors displayed contradictory information, confusing even the most experienced officers. The Empire was no longer a machine of perfect control. It was a fragile network, and Vareth was at its center. Everywhere he went, people reacted differently. Soldiers, conditioned to fear, found themselves questioning orders. Engineers hesitated before initiating commands. Commanders paused, considering alternatives they had never dared imagine. Vareth's influence was subtle yet undeniable. He did not shout, threaten, or attack. He simply existed, guiding the flow of events with a precision that no one could trace. The human spirit, the spark he carried within him, was now reshaping the galaxy. In the outer systems, the ripple of his actions had already taken effect. Colonies long oppressed by the Dominion were experiencing unexpected relief. Supply chains that had failed for decades were restored. Soldiers, once instruments of fear, were choosing to protect life rather than destroy it. Fleets intended to conquer now hesitated, miscalculated, or abandoned missions entirely. Entire planets were spared the violence that had once seemed inevitable. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to those not paying attention, but the change was profound. Life, hope, and freedom were slowly spreading. The Council tried to regain control, but their methods failed. Their own technology betrayed them. Navigation systems that had guided fleets for centuries became unreliable. Communication networks, once flawless, now leaked information that empowered rebellion. Even the most loyal officers hesitated, unsure which orders were genuine and which were influenced by the subtle disruptions Vareth had created. The Empire, once unshakable, was now chaotic. Vareth knew it was time for the next step. His power was no longer limited to subtle influence. He could now coordinate actions across fleets and colonies without directly touching any systems. His presence, his understanding of life, and his human instinct allowed him to anticipate responses and guide events from afar. What had begun as small acts of survival and protection was now a fully strategic dismantling of the Dominion from within. In the central chambers, the Council grew desperate. They had relied on fear to control entire galaxies, and now that fear had evaporated. Fleets refused orders. Colonies acted independently and workers ignored instructions they had once followed blindly. Panic spread through the ranks. Decisions were made hastily, often worsening the situation. And all the while, the human they had kidnapped so long ago moved quietly among them, observing, learning, and guiding the final steps of their unraveling. Vareth did not seek to destroy the Empire for vengeance. He was careful, patient, and deliberate. His goal was balanced, to restore freedom where it had been stolen and to prevent needless suffering. He guided fleets to avoid violent conflict, redirected soldiers to protect civilians, and allowed colonies to organize themselves without interference. The galaxy, long ruled by terror, was finally experiencing hope and autonomy, and it was his presence that made it possible. Even the Dominion's most powerful weapons failed to act as intended. Ships designed for war misfired. Energy grids meant to enforce control fluctuated. Security protocols collapsed. Every tool of the Empire's domination was subtly sabotaged, not by force but by the natural influence of a human life that the Dominion had assumed was powerless. And then, the final moment came. Vareth entered the council chambers openly, not as a thief or a prisoner, but as a force no one could ignore. The council, once confident and untouchable, froze in shock. They saw the human who had been raised under their control, the one they had thought would be their instrument, standing calmly in their midst. And in that moment their fear returned, not fear of punishment, but fear of what they could not understand, the realization that they had been defeated without a single battle. Vareth spoke only once, his voice calm, steady, and clear. He did not shout, threaten, or demand. He simply reminded them of the truth they had tried to ignore. Fear could not control life. Power could not dominate spirit. The Empire had relied on terror, and in doing so, had created the very conditions of its own collapse. The Council realized too late that they had underestimated the human mind, the resilience of life, and the spark that no machine could ever extinguish. Fleets across the galaxy, guided by the subtle signals Vareth had created, stopped attacking. Colonies once oppressed now organized themselves freely. Soldiers laid down arms not out of surrender, but because they recognized that the Empire they had served was no longer the force it had pretended to be. Systems realigned, communications were restored, and the chaos that had been subtly orchestrated by one human life culminated in a transformation of the Dominion itself. Vareth walked through the halls of the Empire as people began to understand that fear was no longer the law. Officers who had once been ruthless realized that their actions could change, that obedience was not the only path. Workers and engineers saw that their knowledge could serve life rather than destruction. Slowly, quietly, the galaxy began to heal under the influence of a single human who had once been taken as a child. Finally, Vareth turned his attention to his own beginnings. The colony from which he had been taken so many years ago had long been forgotten by the Empire, assumed destroyed or lost. He sent signals across space, precise and deliberate, guiding explorers to the location. When the humans arrived, they found remnants of their lost home, preserved but abandoned, and at the center of it all was the realization that one human life had been enough to change the course of history. The Dominion, stripped of its control and humbled, began to dissolve. Planets regained autonomy. Fleets returned home or disbanded. Soldiers laid down arms. And in the midst of it all stood Vareth, not as a conqueror, not as a ruler, but as a guardian, a human who had reminded the galaxy that life, resilience, and hope are more powerful than fear, domination, and cruelty. Earth received the first signals from Vareth directly. Scientists and explorers, who had long monitored anomalies in the outer rim, now understood their origin. They realized that the human taken so long ago had not only survived but had grown into a force capable of reshaping the galaxy. Messages of peace, guidance, and restoration were transmitted. Humanity, long distant from the edge of the Dominion Empire, finally understood the full impact of one life nurtured against impossible odds. Vareth returned to Earth in the way only he could, not as a hero seeking praise, but as a human who had completed a mission far greater than himself. Planets across the galaxy were free. Systems once under fear now operated with cooperation and hope. And in the quiet moments, Vareth reflected on what had been achieved. Not through weapons, not through conquest, but through patience, understanding, and the unwavering human spirit. He visited the ruins of the colony from which he had been taken. He walked among the remnants of buildings, the echoes of voices long gone and the memories of a life that had been stolen. And in that moment, he understood the true power of humanity, the ability to endure, to adapt, and to change the course of history through courage, wisdom, and compassion. Vareth's journey had begun with fear, imprisonment, and loss, but it ended with freedom, hope, and a galaxy transformed. The dominion, once thought unbreakable, had fallen, not to armies, not to weapons, but to the quiet, patient influence of one human life. The galaxy had learned a lesson it would never forget. Never underestimate the power of humanity, even in its smallest and most unlikely forms, and so, the human who had been taken, the child once considered powerless, became a symbol across the stars. Life, resilience, and hope triumphed where fear and domination had failed. And as Vareth looked toward the stars, he knew that the galaxy would never be the same again.